These are the oldest footwear that's ever been found anywhere on the planet Earth, and that's pretty significant.
These are before the pyramids were built. People were walking around in these sandals.
In the 1930s, discoveries by archaeologist Dr. Luther Cressman would challenge all ideas about how and when people first arrived in the Americas.
He was the first to comprehend that there were people from 10,000, 15,000 years ago that inhabited this area.
Husband to Margaret Mead, self-made archaeologist, outspoken agitator. He spent decades defending his work. Only now is science catching up to his groundbreaking theories.
He was really a trailbreaker in the archaeology, not only of the Great Basin, but of North America as a whole.
Funding for Oregon Experience is provided by the Robert D. and Marcia H. Randall Fund for Lifelong Learning, the Oregon Cultural Trust, the Clark Foundation. Additional support provided by the Roundhouse Foundation and viewers like you. Thank you.
This desert landscape may hold the clues to an enduring mystery: how and when prehistoric people arrived in the Americas. Evidence of ancient populations was first uncovered more than 70 years ago by University of Oregon archaeologist Dr. Luther Cressman. Over his long career, Cressman's discoveries would shock and challenge the archaeological world.
I have worked here in the northern Great Basin to describe and understand the way of life of the people who lived here.
Cressman's research began in the 1930s. He believed Oregon's archaeological sites showed that people were in the Americas thousands of years earlier than anyone thought possible, well before the end of the Ice Age.
We know they've lived here for at least 13,000 years, and from indirect evidence, a great deal longer than that.
For the scientific community, the claims were staggering.
The notion was that the peopling of the New World and of what is now the United States was only a couple thousand years old. I mean, like mainly in the Christian era. And that was the going way of thinking when Cressman started his work in the Great Basin.
His research would make him internationally famous and open him to criticism, even ridicule, for decades.
He was accused by some of his colleagues as having falsified his data, and that simply because it couldn't be that old. It couldn't be more than a couple thousand years old.
New technology could set the record straight.
So this is a hearth that we have found in this wall. That is very cool.
Canine's what I was thinking.
Dennis Jenkins of the University of Oregon specializes in prehistoric archaeology of the Great Basin. He and his students have returned to some of the sites Cressman first studied 70 years ago.
Mainly, I'm an archaeologist 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I feel a sense of time. There is no doubt. When I drive along the highways here, I see the results of the water that stood here, that it's gone. Gone. And yet you can see the wave cuts on the sides of the hills.
12,000 years ago, an immense freshwater lake filled these valleys, covering over 400 square miles. The ancient shorelines created wave-cut rock shelters and shallow caves.
It was the fluctuation of the lakes going up and down that created the environment that the native people lived in. And in the dry caves, you could see a lot about their way of life. If something is left entirely dry, then it won't decompose. Lots of plant material and bones and things like that in many of those shoreline caves.
This region is part of the Northern Great Basin, stretching 75,000 square miles through the far western United States. Here, mastodons, camels, wild horses, and other prehistoric animals roamed the landscape until their extinction about 10,000 years ago.
Boy, if there was a mammoth out there, you'd see it. Or a herd of horses, you know. It would be a great place to be able to watch that plane.
Jenkins has spent more than a decade testing Cressman's theories.
I didn't have a dog in the fight. I just simply came here to do science and see who was right.
Were Cressman's controversial theories about when people first arrived in the Americas correct? Finally, there may be answers to the questions first posed decades ago. Luther Shelley Cressman was born in 1897 in rural Pennsylvania. He was one of 6 boys. His father was a country doctor that made house calls. His mother, a music teacher. The family valued education and community service.
Compassion, kindness, understanding, integrity formed the bedrock of the family mother and dad established and nourished. It was in this atmosphere my early values were formed. Luther Cressman.
In 1914, Cressman enrolled at Pennsylvania State College, majoring in the classics, minoring in English poetry.
He learned to read Greek, and they read Homeric epics and stuff like that. I can remember him talking about how fun and interesting it was to read the history of Greece in Greek.
He loved literature, he loved poetry. There was little that he didn't like. He was as much into the humanities, I think, as he was into the sciences.
These interests attracted the attention of a vibrant young admirer, Margaret Mead. Mead would go on to be one of the most influential anthropologists of all time. But in 1917, she was a high school student, enamored with the older Cressman.
She was pretty and charming. They became an item. They fell in love.
They began a long courtship, trading letters filled with poetry.
I remember we were skating on French Creek, and she and I skated together for a long, long time. And I told her all about Antigone, which we had just read in Greek. I recited the whole sorry tragedy to her. Luther Cressman.
By the time Cressman graduated in 1918, World War I was well underway. Poetry from servicemen fighting in Europe stirred him to action.
In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row. The torch be yours to hold it high, if ye break faith with us who die. Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae.
Cressman took up the torch, joining the military.
He was trained, I think, as an artilleryman, but fortunately for him, the war came to an end before he was sent out.
Cressman never saw active duty, but the experience changed him.
The sensitive among us could not help but find the conflict between the utter brutality of the behavior for which we were being trained and the moral values on which our lives were based. the haunting question of why did I have to kill would not go away. Luther Cressman.
The war had ended, but for Cressman, troubling questions lingered. He turned to religion, eventually becoming an Episcopal minister, serving parishes in New York's notorious Hell's Kitchen. He also continued his graduate studies at Columbia, where he was joined by Margaret Mead. After a 6-year engagement, they were married in 1923. Free-thinking Mead bucked tradition and kept her own last name.
Keeping my own name, in which Luther concurred, led to endless explanations, on and on through life, and it made a flutter in the press. Margaret Mead.
Their years at Columbia were formative for the young couple.
He was part of Margaret's circle at Columbia University, which was full of the rising young stars like Margaret herself of that day. So he was acquainted with all kinds of people that I knew as famous anthropologists. They were his pals that they sat around and drank beer after class with.
It was a post-war world. Outdated traditions were being shattered in a modern era of films, automobiles, and jazz-age ideas. The couple's tiny apartment became a gathering place where young intellectuals discussed radical topics of feminism, free love, and racial integration.
She was free with her opinions and stated them forcefully. And I'm sure she would have been a very difficult person to argue with.
The pair studied under famed anthropologist Franz Boas. Boas was one of the first to document Native American cultures. Outspoken and controversial, he encouraged his students to challenge traditional ideas using rigorous scientific standards.
American anthropologists would consider him sort of the father of anthropology in the United States.
Franz Boas created what became a standard 4-field approach to anthropology, uniting the studies of physical and cultural anthropology, linguistics, and archaeology. These ideas of collaboration would become the cornerstone of Cressman's later work.
And that was a great gift of Luther Cressman, was to be very multidisciplinary, not only in his work, but in his life.
In 1925, Cressman and Mead decided to continue their studies separately. Cressman in Europe, Mead in Samoa. The time apart changed them, and they had both met other people. Cressman began questioning his religious beliefs and dedication to the ministry.
And so he didn't think he was a proper minister anymore, and so he resigned and he became a college professor.
After 4 years of marriage, Mead and Cressman parted amicably. Years later, in her autobiography, Mead would refer to the relationship as a student marriage, which rankled Cressman.
Well, he just said a student marriage. Ha! Ha! You know. I mean, what's she doing downplaying this?
But the two remained friends.
He had tremendous regard for her. I think he had nothing but greatest respect for her work and all that she did. She was pretty incredible.
Mead went on to write the best-selling book, Coming of Age in Samoa, and became the most famous anthropologist of her time. After her death, when the conclusions from her field work in Samoa were questioned, Cressman spoke out in her defense.
All social science, but especially anthropology, owes Margaret Mead a tremendous debt.
Life after his divorce from Mead was decidedly different. He married a Scottish woman, Cecilia Locke, and had a daughter, Jem. The family set a new course in the far west when he landed a job teaching at Washington State Normal School. Within a year, they moved again, this time for good, to their new home in Oregon. The year was 1929.
Camden Hall, accommodating the departments of geography and psychology, is appropriately named after Thomas Condon, Oregon's great pioneer geologist.
Luther Cressman was hired by the University of Oregon as a sociologist, and while at the University of Oregon, he developed an interest in archaeology somewhat by accident.
In 1930, a rural farmer planting crops near the southwest Oregon town of Gold Hill uncovered Indian burial mounds. Cressman was invited to view the site. He immediately recognized the importance of the finds.
He just went down to Gold Hill and saw the destruction going on as this farmer was leveling his field and did what he could think of to do about it. He collected the remains, the human remains and the other things, made some pictures and sketches and made a report. That was his education in anthropology and archaeology.
The Gold Hill site turned out to be the most significant find in the area of that time. The Indian burial mounds held 39 human bodies and numerous artifacts, including pipes, knives, and stone bowls thought to be 1,000 years old.
It captivated him, and I think it was a life-changing experience for him because after that moment, he saw himself as an anthropologist, as an archaeologist. It was huge. It's the thing that turned him from a former Episcopal minister and sociologist into an archaeologist.
Archaeology is the study of past cultures and the way people lived based on things they left behind, their artifacts.
Yeah, that's really cool.
I think archaeology attracts people who like puzzles, who like discovery. The job of archaeology is to figure out how things are connected and to figure out what the human stories are that they tell us.
For Cressman, archaeology offered a direct link to ancient people and the mysteries of their lives.
He appreciated the fact that when he handled a piece of basketry or a sandal, that he was touching somebody. I think that affected the way he thought about his work.
He always had stories about whatever he found, and he always could imagine. He, kind of pictured this, and he had that kind of attitude about everything. He was just a good yarn spinner.
Luther was always a classical scholar in that sense, and he had a very romantic view of archaeology.
It was an exciting time in the field. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, swashbuckling explorers were making headlines with daring exploits across the globe. In Egypt, Howard Carter discovered the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun, King Tut, and its priceless treasures. In the Arctic, an ethnographic documentary captured the harsh life of an Eskimo family in Nanook of the North. And in Clovis, New Mexico, the discovery of these distinctive stone points would form the basis of a groundbreaking theory about human habitation of the Americas, known as Clovis First.
For a long time, Clovis was the first thing that we could find that we were really sure of. They're beautifully made. There's no doubt what they are and that they're highly crafted. They've been found associated with giant bison and elephants, so we know people were there by the end of the last glacial age when those animals were still around.
It was believed the people who made these, and many of the animals they hunted, originally came from Asia. The Clovis First model said that at the end of the last ice age, hunter-gatherers crossed a land bridge over the Bering Strait to North America. Then they traveled far inland along an ice-free corridor to the interior of the continent, slowly spreading out across the land. They wouldn't have reached the Great Basin until much later.
When I first started my career, it was all Clovis First. People used to call it Clovis people.
Clovis first became the accepted theory of when and how the Americas were first occupied. But there were always other ideas about the date and route of the earliest people. There just wasn't enough evidence to form an accepted theory.
The real problem with early stuff is that you had much smaller populations. You have fewer people scattered over a large area of the landscape, and so your sample just gets tinier and tinier and tinier the further back in the time you go.
At the same time the Clovis theory was just taking hold with scientists across the country, in the far west, Luther Cressman was developing some theories of his own.
He was willing, even in the 1930s, to claim that people had been out here in the Great Basin since the end of the glacial age. Luther had a broad idea of that, but nothing like the technical expertise that we have now.
For Cressman, his first real archaeological work out in the field began with a study of rock art.
We don't really know what these mean anymore because the people who created them are gone, and each one is specific to the person that created them.
Perry Choctooth is the Director of Culture and Heritage for the Klamath tribes.
We have places in the southern part of our territories where they're in the thousands.
In archaeology, rock art is human-made markings placed on natural stone. They exist all over the world, dating back tens of thousands of years. Petroglyphs are rock carvings, while pictographs are paintings. Oregon has both. But in the 1930s, no one had documented them. Cressman took on the project. Over a period of 3 years, he visited every site he could find.
The way he did that was to draft a letter to postmasters throughout the state.
He said that was a sociological technique of the day, was to choose postmasters for informants because they were kind of evenly spread and they knew everything that was going on in the community, more or less.
In the 1930s, archaeology of the far west was virtually unexplored, and Cressman's expedition had the promise of high adventure.
A graduate student, Howard Stafford, and I drove between 2,100 and 2,500 miles in my Model A and made a very large collection of photographs of petroglyphs.
This was an area that was all dirt roads. Eastern Oregon had 2 paved roads.
Much of the state's rock art is hidden in this desolate landscape, known as Oregon's Outback.
People came here to settle in the early 1900s to homestead. People just wore out. They left. And they left these little houses out here on the desert. So when Cressman came out here, these little buildings and dozens of others had been pretty well just abandoned by people by that time.
Cressman used these deserted buildings as campsites while he explored the region's treasures.
You kind of get this picture of a real expedition. I mean, this was going to do archaeology in the Old West. Cressman's got, a hog leg on, in a holster, and he hated snakes. And he was, I guess he would shoot rattlesnakes with that gun. And I've often thought, boy, he's more in danger of shooting himself than he was of being bitten by a snake.
Cressman explored the entire state, meeting with locals and learning the land. In 1937, he published Petroglyphs of Oregon, documenting 60 sites with rock art.
Well, we have more than 1,000 sites in Lake County, so he missed a few. He thought he'd got them all.
Still, Luther Cressman was making a name for himself. No one else was doing this type of work in the region, and the university supported him.
Luther is kind of a self-made anthropologist. He was given permission to form an anthropology department. That's where the U of O anthropology department came from.
Within his first years at the university, Cressman became the region's expert, and he and his students had autonomy throughout the state.
So here he was suddenly 5 years, 6 years after he'd been here, he was department head of his own one-man department and director of the Museum of Natural History and director of the Museum of Anthropology. So he was suddenly in the midst of it. He wanted to be the boss.
But he also had learned the importance of seeking help from experts in other fields, and he drew on a wide variety of sources.
People who studied the natural plants and animals, the pollen rain, the volcanic ash falls, the lake terraces, all of those things. Luther worked with those people.
And that kind of collaboration with many different disciplines was something that was a hallmark of his work. It was breaking new ground as to how to do archaeology the right way.
He also consulted with local Native American tribes who retained a wealth of knowledge about traditional Aboriginal culture.
If we look at the cultures of the American Indians, we'll find that in different areas they concentrated on different kinds of materials for their tools, instruments, and so on. And these not only served that purpose, but they also served as a medium for artistic expression. In the Great Basin, the Indians concentrated on basketry almost entirely.
He was very good at establishing a relationship and realizing that it's the people. Study the people first. Build that relationship, and the science will come.
In the early 20th century, the official government policy towards tribal people was assimilation.
At the time Cressman was working, archaeologists really didn't pay any attention to Native Americans as people.
Today, the Native American Graves Protection Act requires consultation and repatriation of human remains and burial items recovered on archaeological sites. Tribes argue prehistoric remains belong to their ancestors and shouldn't be studied.
We never were removed from our Aboriginal territories.
The Klamath tribes believe they have lived on this land from time immemorial.
Our creation stories say we were created right here by our Creator.
And artifacts indicate their ancestors have lived here for thousands of years. Baskets, like these, have been made in the same unique style, in the same region since prehistoric times. It's tantalizing evidence of a direct link between the modern Indian tribes and some of the first people to live in the Americas.
There is a continuity of that tradition that extends through 9,000 plus years that I don't think is matched anywhere in the world. I think it's pretty remarkable.
If you could live in one place in the northern Great Basin at the end of the Ice Age, this would have been one of the very best places to be, just an abundance of resources.
Evidence of the ancient people who lived here still exists, preserved and hidden away in these caves for thousands of years.
Before Luther Cressman got here, people were finding things, and people had things in private collections. But a lot of things probably were just, neat things on the ground that local residents picked up and went, wow, that's cool, I'm going to take it home, probably like a lot of us would have done at the time.
Some of the amateurs actually are very responsible people and so forth, but there are an awful lot of them that really are simply looters.
Today, there are laws in place to protect archaeological sites on public lands. That's because removing any artifact, no matter how small, can have a big impact on research.
The smallest thing could be the most important. What it is, how it was produced, the context it is, how it relates to other things that have been recovered. Each fragment or each artifact is priceless as far as the information that it represents.
In the 1930s, artifacts were still easily found in the rural deserts, and Cressman was determined to protect and study them.
He recognized perishable artifacts, basketry sticking out of the sidewalls, such a unique treasure. And that really motivated the next phase of his work, which focused on cave sites throughout the rest of the 1930s.
He fell into this rich trove of evidence, unparalleled in most parts of the country.
This atlatl, the first one ever found in Oregon, and the only one of its kind that I know of in the United States. It's likely that this type of weapon came to the New World from the Old World, from Asia.
In 1937, Cressman and some of his students began exploring caves along the cliffs of Catlow Valley in southeastern Oregon. They documented the excavation in this film.
He was really very thorough in terms of making a record of what he did. He kept very good field notes. He cataloged things very carefully, which is incredibly valuable.
Reading through his notes in the museum is just like, you know, being there throughout the day. And occasionally he would write down lunch at the cafe in Burns, $1.60.
It was dirty, tedious work, done by hand in primitive conditions.
None of this early work of mine would have been possible without the aid of many students. In the early days, these students worked without wages. As a matter of fact, they paid to go along.
The dust is just billowing up all day long, caked on you. You're hot, you're sweaty, no air conditioning.
There were no hotels or running water. Laundry was done with a washboard. Cleanup was sometimes in a cow trough. Dinner was Cressman's pancakes or bean soup.
It was quite an expedition to get here in the first place, bring all this equipment and be able to do legitimate archaeology.
All of their efforts proved worthwhile when they uncovered a treasure, one that gave a direct personal link to the prehistoric people who used this area.
We found one day a pair of sandals that had been worn by some small child. They were tied together by a tie string, and close by these were two very small baskets. They were in very good shape. They were not thrown away. Something must have happened to that youngster and her family. Went out one morning and never came back.
The find was enticing, sparking even more questions. Who were these ancient people? How did they live? Where did they come from?
It's not just the artifacts they made, but the real story is how they organized themselves and they interacted with others. What I find interesting is thinking about what people did and why they did it, how they were able to do it.
Cressman got his first clues to those mysteries when a U.S. Forest Service worker pointed him to another set of caves in the region, known as 5 Mile Caves, later called Paisley Caves.
Paisley Caves became important because the quality of the evidence there is so overwhelming.
The cluster of caves had an undisturbed layer of volcanic ash from the eruption of Mount Mazama. Then, no one knew when the volcano had blown, but it still provided an important time marker. Items below the ash layer had to be older than the eruption.
That became very important because The Mount Mazama eruption was so huge, it blanketed a lot of Central Oregon with volcanic ash, and in fact, there's a veneer of ash that extends as far as the Great Plains.
That eruption created Crater Lake. Now a national park, the lake has long been sacred to local Native American tribes. Tribal oral tradition includes stories of the explosion, indicating their ancestors witnessed the cataclysmic event.
People were here and watched that mountain explode and probably were terrified.
Giant fireballs shot out toward the land of the Moklaks, exploding in deafening booms 5 times in rapid succession. Spewing fire from his mouth, the evil chief ran to the top of the caldera to survey the destruction. As fire and lava devoured the beautiful forests and lay waste to the villages of the people.
The date of the eruption was estimated to be somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 years ago.
The people assumed that, well, yes, if there were humans below Mount Mazama, Mazama pumice was late. It was not that early.
But no one knew for sure. But at Paisley Caves, Cressman found evidence that the eruption was much older than most people thought. Under the Mazama ash layer, he discovered the remains of a charred sagebrush campfire. And that wasn't all. He also found fragments of spear points, tools, and bones of animals that had died out over 10,000 years ago.
And I recognized one of them as camel bone. Well, that was a terrific discovery, that we had camel bone here, and that the camel bone had been broken. Obviously, they'd eaten the meat off of it, and it was in this ash. Fireplace is what it was.
Yes, there were Pleistocene animals. Yes, there were cultural artifacts. But what was the nature of the association? Cressman found them together and believed they belonged together, but he wasn't able to demonstrate that in a convincing way to a lot of his colleagues.
That was always one of the main problems, actually getting dates that everybody was willing to trust.
Within just a few years of arriving in Oregon, Cressman's work was challenging the accepted theories of other more established researchers, and that created tension with other scientists and academics. In his memoirs, he recalls feeling attacked when giving a presentation at the Smithsonian.
He alienated people many places, including on campus. I mean, other department heads and things like that.
He was a tough guy. He kind of stood up to people.
He could be an obnoxious so-and-so, which he could. I mean, there was no question about it. And I think anybody who dealt with him would have to realize that.
In 1938, another important find would bring even more skepticism, but this time it would also bring international fame. The discovery was in a weathered overhang locals called Cow Cave.
When Cressman's team got here in 1938, most probably the level of the cave, the floor level was probably about right here. So all that material, including that much cow manure right off the bat, had to be removed.
The cave is near the extinct Tough Ring volcano, Fort Rock, and is now called Fort Rock Cave.
One of the great things here in the cave that you can still see is this line on the wall that kind of stands out, and that is the contact point of the ash from the eruption of Mount Mazama.
It was here, under that layer of ash, that Cressman discovered the find of his career, a cache of about 75 sagebrush sandals.
Now the interesting thing here is that we have a toe flap. The toe fit in here, and careful examination of this sole shows mud encased in it. But the significant thing about this is that Had to be mud, had to be rain, had to be water around here to get mud encased in this. Wherever this chap wore this sandal is none now.
The sandals were obviously ancient, but surprisingly sophisticated. They are now called Fort Rock-style sandals. Over the years, similar sandals have also been discovered in other nearby caves.
You know, you look at them and you can see the impression of a human foot in the sandal, you know, where the heel wore, where the balls of the feet wore. There is really a humanness, I guess, that you can almost touch.
This is a pair of replica sagebrush bark sandals that were created with impeccable detail, almost a stitch-by-stitch reproduction of sandals that were found here at the caves. There's just something about a pair of shoes, I think, that really has a great connection to people because we all can appreciate a good pair of shoes.
The sandals generated public interest. People wanted to know how old were they, who left them, and why.
Looking at the sandals from Fort Rock Cave, we see big ones and we see little ones. And you really get a sense of community. Grandmas and nephews and brothers and cousins.
We have kind of a perceived notion that they were brutes, they were kind of stupid, not so good at pretty much anything, but they were far from that. They had elders dying, babies being born. They probably didn't get along with their neighbors sometimes probably got along very good with their neighbors.
Cressman believed he now had additional compelling proof that ancient people lived in the area thousands of years earlier than previously believed, anywhere from 10 to 15,000 years ago.
He met with a lot of skepticism from his colleagues. It can't be that old.
That finally changed in the 1950s when scientist Willard Libby unveiled radiocarbon dating. The process could accurately date organic material back tens of thousands of years. Libby would win a Nobel Prize for the discovery, and archaeology would forever be changed. Cressman immediately understood carbon dating's potential.
Libby was not an archaeologist, and so he depended on samples that were sent to him, and Cressman sent him a number of them.
Cressman arranged for testing on material from the Mount Mazama eruption. They were some of the first radiocarbon tests ever conducted, finally pinpointing a date on the cataclysmic event, over 7,000 years ago.
Cressman was right. He would show that, look, this is pretty early stuff. You're not talking about 2,000 years, you're talking about 7 or 8.
Cressman knew radiocarbon dating might finally pinpoint the age of the Fort Rock-style sandals, which were found under the ash layer. But there was a problem.
He added preservative to a number of the sandals so that they wouldn't fall apart, but it also compromised the integrity of the sandals, so some of them were not suitable for later radiocarbon dating.
That meant Cressman had to use other Fort Rock sandals, found by an amateur artifact collector.
Cressman never talked about that. Cressman didn't dig them up.
That might have opened him up to even further criticism, because they were collected without rigorous scientific documentation.
It's something that some of those people who didn't want it to be so early might well have latched on to.
But at the time, that information was glossed over. Still, the results were staggering for Cressman and the archaeological world. The sandals were nearly 10,000 years old. They were made before written language, before the first known wheel, when almost all people were still hunter-gatherers.
It proved him right in the face of all his previous detractors. They are the oldest directly dated shoes in the world.
These are before the pyramids were built. People were walking around in these sandals in Oregon.
The Klamath County Museum in rural southern Oregon displays 2 sandals. They are on permanent loan from the University of Oregon. The sandals are a treasure among the Wild West artifacts that represent the heritage of this region.
To have such a important and significant object in our display, in our exhibits, is really something that everyone should be proud of in this community. People may not realize that we have such an important World Heritage object in such a small museum. They represent human activity in this area at a very, very early time. And they tie into that debate of the first Americans in America, you know, the kind of debate that is full of controversy. This is one of the earliest markers of human presence in the area that we have.
The peopling of the Americas is a hotly debated topic, one that continues to this day. But at the time, it was even more contentious. In the 1950s, scientists had fully embraced the Clovis first theory, which assumed there were no people in the Great Basin when the sandals were made. Even with radiocarbon dates, some in the scientific community questioned Cressman's research. It didn't fit with the established theory.
The idea of people being here for 10 or 12,000 years was kind of off the charts at that time. And so there was a great reluctance to accept what he presented.
That he knew that these were of substantial age, and to be questioned and ridiculed about that must have been really frustrating for him.
He was very single-minded. When he had written something and somebody came out and argued against it, he was irate always, because once he reduced something to paper, it had to be the truth, so far as he was concerned. And he would defend it to the death.
The sandals remain Cressman's most famous discovery, but he did work all over the state. He excavated sites along the Columbia River, finding tools, nets, and bones deep into the sediment.
If you lived along the Columbia River up there by the Dalles, you were living on the greatest fishing site in all of North America. It's a long stretch of rapid water where you can get down close to the water and you can spear and net and otherwise catch fish.
Cressman's work showed people had been fishing in the same way, in the same spot for 10,000 years, providing further evidence for his theories of early human occupation.
He was the guy that learned an enormous amount about this part of the country, and everybody knew that.
He published numerous books and scholarly papers. For decades, he was the leading force behind anthropology and archaeology in the state, and helped draft antiquities laws protecting archaeological sites.
He was obviously driven. I mean, he worked like hell all the time. He was just energetic, always busy, always doing something. He really wanted to know what was out there.
He was always working to validate his theories of early occupation. He studied the link between prehistoric people of the deserts and the ocean beaches, documenting over 100 coastal village sites. He wrote grants funding his research, won 2 Guggenheim Fellowships, and oversaw the University of Oregon doctorate program in anthropology. And he maintained his relationships with scholars all over the country, including his now famous ex-wife.
Margaret Mead came here once, and I remember we were a bunch of graduate students sitting around, and he was asking her questions and she was responding. At the time, you wondered what their relationship was now, and it seemed to be amicable enough.
But after years of fending off critics, he had gained a reputation with some of his colleagues as being cantankerous.
Cressman had a strong personality. He had his loyal admirers and he had his detractors. I think that there were people that he rubbed the wrong way.
I think you'd have to say he was not totally beloved. When I introduced Cressman for a talk one time, and I said something about his being a rather crusty bird, a former chancellor of the state system of higher education in the back of the room suddenly was shouting, "Here, here, here."
When he retired in 1963, He was known as the father of anthropology and archaeology in the state and was called the Chief.
He was a part of the University of Oregon campus, part of the state. So to us, there was a sense of heroism, a sense of the first guy.
For the rest of his life, he kept active, writing and working, and remained involved at the Natural and Cultural History Museum he founded, where most of the Fort Rock sandals reside today.
His legacy is certainly of the founding father. There's no question about that. He's the one who started it. He was there. There's no doubt. He was Adam.
In 1963, Cressman gave the dedication speech when Fort Rock Cave became a National Historic Landmark. 3 years later, he returned to Fort Rock to assist in another excavation there. It was then that his student, Stephen Bedwell, made another groundbreaking discovery: a charcoal hearth and tools even older than the Fort Rock sandals.
And the charcoal from that hearth was dated to 13,200 some odd radiocarbon years ago and is a valid date.
The find was shocking. It meant people were in the Great Basin before an ice-free corridor had allowed human migration from Siberia, before Clovis, before just about anyone at the time thought possible.
The ice-free corridor, that was not open. So how did people get here?
That was a question some people didn't want to address. It would change decades' worth of theories, and Stephen Bedwell died before his research was finished, though Cressman was a staunch champion of the work.
Although he was not able to convince a lot of his colleagues of his ideas, he was right an awful lot of the time.
When Cressman died in 1994, at the age of 96, he was renowned for his achievements. But by the larger scientific community, his findings were still questioned. That is, until Bill Cannon persuaded modern University of Oregon archaeologists to take up Cressman's research at Paisley Caves.
I flim-flammed the archaeologists at the universities a little bit, gave them a good song and dance, and got them out here to work for us.
Cressman had considered the cave one of the most promising sites in all of North America, but had no way to definitively prove it.
That cave is important, therefore, for the reason that it's the one place in the Great Basin where we have a completely valid association of man with those extinct animals.
And I have just loved how many times you and others have proven Cressman to be correct in his early interpretations of these sites out here. It's really quite amazing for the time period he was working in.
Absolutely, and he didn't have the benefit of the methods and technology that we have.
Yeah.
Coming out.
Today, the research at Paisley Caves is building on Cressman's work. The findings here continue to challenge established timelines and are finally forcing scientists to throw out the old theories.
Well, it was here in cave number 5 that we found the oldest human coprolites that we managed to get human DNA out of.
Coprolites are fossilized feces, human waste. Jenkins and his team first discovered these, along with human artifacts, during a series of archaeological digs beginning in 2002.
So this is a coprolite. We've recovered about 1,800 of them from the Paisley Caves. The oldest human coprolites that we have here in these tubs are about 14,600 years. So extremely old, very early in the colonization of the Americas.
The coprolites were studied at the Center for Geogenetics at the University of Copenhagen. At the time of the test, Coprolites from Paisley Caves provided the oldest human DNA samples ever found in the Western Hemisphere. That makes these caves in rural Oregon some of the earliest verified sites of human habitation in the Americas, just as Cressman first predicted more than 70 years ago.
This 14,500-year-old coprolite is 1,000 years before this Clovis era. We need to continue to look further back into time.
We're still wondering how much farther back we can go.
Discoveries are made every year. In 1977, the Manus mastodon was found in Washington state. It had a projectile point made from a different mastodon embedded in its rib. For decades, it was dismissed, but recent tests dated the site at over 13,000 years. And in 1996, a skeleton found on the banks of the Columbia River, known as Kennewick Man, turned out to be over 9,000 years old. These finds, and others, are sparking new questions about how and when people first arrived in the Americas.
Dr. Cressman's legacy is that he was right. People were in these sites at a very early date. Some of the earliest dates in North America are coming from these sites. And again, I think he would just be tickled pink with what's going on today.
I think he would have been really pleased to see the evidence that we have today, because I think that was exactly what he was thinking a couple of generations ago.
Research continues on the sandals and the caves. The next generation of scientists, armed with new technology, continue the quest started by Luther Cressman decades ago.
He's the one that first learned what we think we know today. So it's huge. I mean, he was our founding father.
Luther Cressman left a legacy of respect and protocols in the science that anthropologists now follow.
I think his legacy was leaving us with some of the pieces of the puzzle. He started it and gave us a good basis, and we keep working, we keep plugging away at it.
There's more about Luther Cressman, Quest for First People, on Oregon Experience Online. To learn more or to order a DVD of the show, visit opb.org. Funding for Oregon Experience is provided by the Robert D. and Marcia H. Randall Fund for Lifelong Learning, the Oregon Cultural Trust, the Clark Foundation. Additional support provided by the Roundhouse Foundation and viewers like you. Thank you.